for coming to give evidence to us this morning. Do I take it all three of you have listened to what we've just been hearing, and that you were in the room?
I wasn't in the room.
You weren't?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, well then let's start with Professor Graham, and then maybe Mr. Overman chip in if you want, and then I'll ask another preliminary question to Mr. Wellings. In response to the questions that I opened with, and a number of people followed up on, we've been told that the 15 billion figure per annum for over the 60-year period is robust, that it's a forecast, and we've been told, it seems to me, in a somewhat contradictory way, that the key statistical work behind it is reasonable and reliable. And there was some discussion about its reliability. What would you like to say about that?
Okay, I wouldn't agree with that. I don't think the statistical work is reliable, and I've got a few key concerns with it that relate really to how we would deal with this issue if we were, doing an academic project, or even indeed a student project, not necessarily a research project. And there are some issues that you would straight off want to address. One of them is that the way the work was done in the report, it kind of attributes to connectivity all of the things that affect productivity without incorporating them in the model. So if you've got a model that's only got connectivity really as the key thing that affects productivity, you're going to attribute lots of things to connectivity that actually just happen to be correlated with it, but that aren't down to the connectivity itself. So the first issue is it doesn't deal with what's called confounding. So that's potentially a problem. The second issue is that it doesn't deal with the problem of reverse causality. What I mean by that is that we tend to put transport maybe in places that are more productive. So the relationship between productivity and transport is bidirectional. Places that are more productive tend to have better developed transport systems. Think of London, for instance. It doesn't address that problem. And I think that the third issue is that this business of how what they called spreading the elasticity isn't done according to any conventional statistical approach that I can think of. The problem they had actually was a problem that's called equivalence of outcomes, where what they wanted to know is how do we apportion the connectivity effect across different modes? But the statistics wouldn't let them do it because all these things are so highly correlated. And my approach to that would be, don't try and do it. It wouldn't be to try and use some strange approach to apportion or spread that effect. I just don't.
Would you be prepared to set down on a piece of paper in as near as possible layman's language the point about the equivalence of outcomes with respect to the coefficients? Because it seems to me that lies at the heart of whether this 15 billion figure is per annum is rubbish in, rubbish out, or whether it's something on which, as we were told earlier this morning, we should rely. That is absolutely crucial. The whole project, it seems to me, stands or falls on, at the moment, on this piece of work, and this piece of work relies very heavily on that piece of statistical analysis. If I'm not correct, tell me I'm not correct.
No, I think that is correct. It does rely heavily on that piece of statistical analysis, but what I'm saying, in addition to that problem, there's problems with the numbers that they've generated that they then want to spread in the first instance, in my opinion.
I've understood that point. And we've got those on the record. It's this, even looking at it on their own terms, I think we need as a committee to have an analysis of those coefficients. Professor Overman.
I'd reiterate what Dan has said. The issue about the treatment of the estimates that they get is an important one within the context of what they're doing. Although I have to say I don't actually think that that's the first order concern about the substantive prediction that you will get out. So they apply this statistical procedure, which really well, it's not a statistical procedure. I mean, that's they apply this procedure, which is essentially made up, that provides them with an estimate, and that is something that really shouldn't be being done in a situation where we're trying to inform public debate using a sort of statistical analysis.
That's a very serious allegation. You're saying they've just made it up.
But if you're trying to get at the impact of something like connectivity on productivity using a set of statistical techniques, you need to play by the rules. You have to implement procedures that will give you the best chance of getting an accurate assessment of what a change in productivity will do in terms of a change of wages. And I mean, there were two problems, technical problems with what they've done, and then there's a more substantive point about the economics of it. You're pushing on the technical points. So the two technical problems were as follows. Number one, they had these 4 connectivity estimates that they couldn't separate out the individual effects on. So they looked at them one at a time. And looking at them one at a time will always bias upwards the impact of any one individual effect, because you will attribute to good rail connectivity the fact that places with good rail connectivity also have good car connectivity. So this is the problem, a technical problem of using partial correlation coefficients or univariate regressions where you should be using multivariate. So that was step one, which is a technical problem where they basically said, well, we can't separate these things out, so let's just look at them one at a time. Looking at them one at a time will bias up each of the individual effects. And then they said, well, now we've got these individual effects, how are we going to combine them? And the way they combined them is completely non-standard and further biases upwards the effect. So if you look at their report...
When you say, can you unpick the phrase non-standard for us? So what do you mean by non-standard?
Well, there is no...
creative and useful or not?
No,
we need
just
to know whether they've done something that can help us look at these sort of projects in the future.
No, I mean, you're just taking partial correlation coefficients and adding them up in the way that they did is just non-informative, I'm afraid. I mean, so that part of it that gets to the 15 billion number from the underlying partial correlation coefficients has no statistical basis. And just coming along and proposing a sort of solution that has no statistical basis really doesn't get us very far, because we have no idea how to interpret those estimates. Now,
so as a layman, I'm sorry to keep interrupting
sure.
you, Professor Overman, but as a layman, is it right for a layman to conclude from that, well, you've got to do something, so at least they've taken this forward and that can help us so that we can understand where the value might lie, or is this rubbish in, rubbish out?
I don't think that aspect of what they've done is at all helpful. They are basically, doing something that is completely non-standard that gives them an estimate of £15 billion. Now, when they share weight those partial correlation coefficients, which I've already told you are problematic anyhow, but when they share weight them, the number reduces to £8 billion. I would much rather have seen the £8 billion come out as their central estimate within the way that they were approaching the problem. That would still be a large overestimate. It would be a large overestimate partly because they estimated each of these effects individually, and then because of more substantive problems about the interpretations of those estimates that Dan has alluded to, but that I haven't yet addressed in my own personal comments.
Okay. Mr. Wellings, Dr. Wellings, I apologise. You have written quite a bit about this subject, and I've read it. Your central, or one of the main points you've made, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this project has been captured by vested interest groups.
Yes.
In other words, a relatively small group of people in the country, and those representing them, are pushing for something that will be paid for at the expense of the rest of the country. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a classic example.
And what is the evidence that you have to support that view?
Yes, I mean, in my view, it's a classic example of concentrated benefits versus dispersed costs. So it's a logic of collective action problem in the public choice jargon, where the main losers are dispersed taxpayers who face this enormous tax bills of potentially £3,000 per household. Because they're spread out across the whole country, their incentives to engage in collective action, to campaign, lobby, etc., political action is very low. Whereas you have some very narrow, concentrated interests with huge incentives to get involved in the lobbying process, collective action process. For example, train companies that stand to potentially win a £7.5 billion contract to manufacture the high-speed trains. The local authorities around some of the stations who will capture these massive regeneration grants from the taxpayer. Also, obviously, there's a potential of with senior officials as well to see their own careers and status to be enhanced by High Speed 2 and the opportunities it presents. I mean, a huge amount of evidence. I mean, the only concentrated opposition really is the people along the route, and so you see you see concentrated pros and concentrated antis battling it out, but you don't really see the taxpayers getting involved, even though they're the largest group in terms of the amount of money they're going to lose. So, but you see, the various pro-high-speed rail campaigns being funded by Birmingham City Council, Manchester City Council, being funded by some of the major train manufacturers. You have pro-HS2 conferences being organised by with HS2 Limited there, and also the train manufacturers there, engineering companies there, the city councils there who are going to get the massive regeneration subsidies. So I this is really, I was actually surprised how well this HS2 fits the theory. I think it's an absolutely classic example.
Okay, that's a helpful introduction to your way of thinking about the project. Andrew, let's...
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. I'd like to focus a bit on the benefit-cost ratio. And first of all, Dr. Wellings, there is talk of the DFT's own rules are that you shouldn't include the wider economic benefit in calculating a benefit-cost ratio. But obviously, it shows a significantly lower BCR if you don't include the wider economic impact. Have you done any work on that yourself, and can you tell us whether excluding wider economic benefits is essential or just a matter of choice in this project?
Well, I think the looking at standard literature on this, the wider economic benefits are generally fairly low. I prefer not to include them because they're so questionable and nebulous. And they also have to be set against wider economic losses. So you've got something called dead weight losses. It goes beyond the direct cost of the tax bill. It's this sort of extra cost to society due to the economic activity that's suppressed by the tax bill. And it's typically, it varies depending on how the tax is raised. It varies enormously. It's relatively low for things like VAT, relatively high for things like fuel duty. It's potentially extremely high if something's funded with government borrowing under certain circumstances where the government's already got high debts, etc. So I think usually, as a rule of thumb, the wider economic benefits are usually more than exceeded by these wider economic costs from the deadweight losses. So I think.
And has any work been done by the DFT or by you yourself in terms of assessing the wider economic costs?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to do because you don't actually have the knowledge to do that, because can't really tell what the marginal pound in tax is going to be raised or borrowing. So you just have to make this assumption, and that's part of what the Treasury's job is, to factor that into the equation. That's why they usually demand a much higher BCR than 1 before a project goes ahead. And assuming that the BCRs also, the people behind the project are probably exaggerating the BCR. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why you want a very high number before going ahead, even before you get into the whole opportunity cost argument. So it's your view, just to be very clear, it's your view that the wider economic benefits should be excluded from the BCR. That would be the right way to do this. I think that's right. I mean, I don't think that's I think the webs are generally derivative of the other elements of the standard elements of the BCR anyway. So in terms of deciding between projects, I think I don't think it makes an enormous difference to exclude them. But I think, given that they're so nebulous and difficult to calculate, I mean, going back to the KPMG reports, I mean, personally, I think it's highly questionable that you can make reliable forecasts of 24 years in advance, given political risks, disruptive technologies, etc., etc. So,
but that doesn't really answer it, does it, Dr. Wellings? Because you've got to do something. That would say, well, because you can't forecast something, we better not do anything where the returns don't come in for a quarter of a century. So it is difficult, but we have to acknowledge that they've got a challenge on their hands.
No, but the point
We're asking whether they've made the best effort.
But you're deciding between different projects anyway. It's an opportunity cost argument, so I don't think that's the answer. So.
Okay. So, Professor Overman, the fact that this BCR has gone down in this latest report, should we take that as sinister or just kind of all swivelling out in the wash? Does it matter that it's gone down?
Well, actually, I take a slightly different view to Dr. Wellings. I think the BCR and the BCR with wider economic benefits are two important pieces of information that we should take into account when trying to make a decision about £50 billion worth of expenditure, because otherwise we're guessing. I mean, otherwise we have no mechanism for thinking about how to spend our scarce resources. So I would make the following distinction, though, that in the DFT's own guidance, at least the version of it that I accessed last week, which is called the web tag guidance, they suggest that BCRs should be presented without the wider economic benefits. Now, my reading of that is that they should be presented without the wider economic benefits for the purpose of the value for money comparisons that DFT make when they're calling something very poor, medium, etc. So, my view on that is that you should take the 1.8 BCR that comes out of that and using DFT's own guidance say that's a medium value project. Now, I have to say that, I went back and looked what it takes to be a medium value project in the sort of distribution of all the BCRs we have out there for transport projects, and it appears that, medium value you can get in if you're sort of in the bottom 25%. So I'm not sure that medium is a sort of standard way in which we'd use that word, but I think the 1.8 is informative. And then I think that you add the wider economic benefits onto that and report them as a separate component, because they are our best estimates at the moment of the wider economic benefits, the productivity gains, etc. I would make a distinction between those wider economic benefits that are reported in the economic case and the KPMG report, which gives you these huge gains if you net present value them. And that's because I think that those KPMG estimates are very overstated. So I do take the numbers seriously. So sorry, to come then back to whether or not we should take the 1.8 credibly, my detailed involvement with HS2 Limited and the underlying analytical work they were doing around the BCRs ended, I think, 18 months ago, some period ago. At that point, I found that they had done a reasonable case in trying to assess those BCRs and those wider economic benefits that appear in the economic case reasonably carefully. It's harder for me to assess the variations that have happened since. I mean, the predominant issue seems to be we valued the business use down, so therefore let's increase the number of business users that we assume are going to do this, and the sort of cost benefit, those two sort of changes.
What you're saying, Professor Overman, sort of makes it sound as if it's just really a finger in the air. I mean, is it at all reliable? And particularly, is it at all reliable on a standalone basis? Is it not the case that it's only really useful if you're comparing 10 projects and you've got a BCR with wider economic benefits assessed on the same basis for each of those 3 or 5 or 10 projects? I mean, can this on a standalone basis be at all useful?
So let me answer the two parts of that question. I don't think it's just a finger in the air exercise. I don't think it should be the only thing that we are taking into account when we make decisions about investments. Because otherwise there would be no need for you guys, and you just get me ranking the BCRs and making a decision. But I think it's unfair to suggest that it's not picking up something real. These are best estimates about what we think the relative benefits, the cost of this project would be, and of course they're hugely uncertain. Well, then they're uncertain, but I still think that the central point estimates are informative. I do think how you use them is to make comparison to other projects. Now, the DFT guidance, when it classes things as poor, medium, etc., I understood to be doing that on the basis of the standard BCR. if you want to make the comparison on the basis of the BCR with the wider economic benefits included, and here I'm talking about those in the economic case, you should go back to the Eddington report. The Eddington report did try adding in those wider economic benefits. I had to say, I actually printed off this morning to see where it would stack up. Interurban corridors that Eddington looked at in 2006, the bottom 25%, it looks to me, had a BCR including wider economic benefits that would be about 2.5. So that places, so that does give you a feeling that BCR with the wider economic benefits in would put high-speed rail in about the bottom 25% of interurban corridors that we had, and it would be even lower if we looked at all of the types of schemes we had on the book, because I'm only telling you the interurban schemes there. So I think you're right, you shouldn't consider it in isolation, you should think about it in a portfolio of things, but I think you're wrong to suggest that we should just ignore the number, that there's no information content in it.
Okay. And Professor Graham, in terms of the argument for HS2, it's moved from one of speed to one of capacity and overcrowding. Is that a reasonable argument, bearing in mind that the West Coast Main Line isn't the most overcrowded line? And what about obviously you're there to answer the question about the benefit-cost ratio, but if one were simply looking at capacity and overcrowding, is again the central necessity to then look at where is the greatest problem with capacity and overcrowding, and why aren't we looking at a high-speed line to solve that problem first before this one?
It's just an easy question there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I won't answer that because I'm not an expert in capacity and overcrowding in the network. What I would like to say, just to add to Henry's point, is that benefit cost analysis has been established over several decades now. There's a strong theoretical basis for it, and over the decades we've built up empirical evidence which has been rigorously reviewed, both within government and by academics and through the peer review process. And that counts also for wider economic benefits, which are, if you like, one of the more recent additions to benefit cost. The thinking was, there's something missing, can we measure them? Now, none of this is perfect, but we understand the assumptions behind it, we understand the theory, and the empirical evidence gets reviewed, and it's there. So it's perfectly clear. It's all there. We can all look at it, we can debate it. The problem with the KPMG approach is that approach hasn't got that history, it's not got that academic support, it's not got the theoretical support. And that's the difference. So when we talk about wider economic benefits and cost-benefit analysis, we're talking about something that's very specific that we've really thought about and that we've analysed and put up to public scrutiny. And I was heavily involved in that work. That's not the case with the report that we were discussing today.
Right. So what would be your advice to the government in order to get that accuracy? Is it possible to redo the report, to do a further report and do it on the proper statistical basis that you and Professor Overman have outlined?
Undoubtedly the work could be done better, yes. My advice to any government would be, if you want to think seriously about whether investments are worth making, you have to look at things like benefit cost, because we have to be analytical about it. The 15 billion to me may be true, but certainly nothing in that report indicates to me that it's true. So there isn't a scientific basis for it, is what I'm saying. And I think we could do a better job.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, just to be clear, what you're really saying is that KPMG was set the wrong exam question, that they should have been asked a different set of questions, which would have included which would have enabled them to look at the cost-benefit analysis in a completely different way. In fact, they've hardly looked at the cost side, they've only looked at the benefits.
No, I think... Sorry, I'm not sure who you're addressing that question to. But yeah,
I was addressing that to Professor Grant, but chip in.
No, that's I mean, the discussion there we're having is a way about how you present these things. You can take the numbers that they're doing and try and figure out what they look like on a net present value basis. They look too high. I think that the point we're trying to make is that, as a part of the debate that happened around Eddington and other debates at the time, going back 20 years, we felt that the traditional standard benefit cost appraisal process was missing something, that Dan Graham and others went out and spent, and carefully tried to assess that by coming up with this wider economic benefits that are now part of the NATA refresh. We've got a mechanism for presenting those. So I think that the difficulty with the KPMG report is that we got all of that, and then there were still people out there that wanted that felt that for some reason that was underestimating the benefits, and they were then sent off to look at the wider economic benefits, and they've come back with an answer which I'm afraid seems to me to be way too large. Given some, and that's partly to do with the approach that they adopted and the robustness, etc. of the
We're not
report.
going to try and do this now in front of the committee, but if Professor Overman and Professor Graham were locked in a room together for an afternoon, would you be able to come out with an agreed methodology on how this should have been done?
We'd be able to improve it, that's for sure.
Well,
Because there's certain fundamental problems with it.
Very risky saying anything we're near yes to that question, because if you could try and do that, we'd be extremely grateful. But I'm not pinning you down. I just think it would be of some use to have an approach from experts on how we might get to a more thorough and reliable reply.
Well, I think that
question.
I mean, the one thing I would say on that is that taking into account the evidence that is out there, I have suggested that if you applied corrections based on what we know from the literature, that you would certainly reduce the estimated magnitude by a factor of 6 to 8. And I think that is coming off of experience in the academic literature where we have corrected for some of the problems in this report. So.
I've got a few more colleagues want to comment. Mark Garnier.
Thank you, Chairman. We've heard this morning quite a lot of talk from you guys about the fact that there seems to be sort of slightly creative methodology used in terms of doing this. What do you think is driving this approach? Professor Graham?
I wouldn't want to guess. I think it's partly perhaps the people who wrote the report weren't aware of the latest techniques in this area. I mean, it does seem to me that the approach from the very beginning was under-ambitious in a way, in terms of the data it was prepared to deal with. The work that Henry and his group at LSE have done, some of the work I've done, is based on much more extensive data and models that are trying to incorporate, do things a bit more carefully, we might say. So I think it's under-ambitious. I don't know why they took that approach. I mean, I haven't been involved at any stage in the work, I have to say.
Does anybody else? Professor Overman?
Well, yes, I can't, it would be hard to me to say. I mean, it's either something to do with the client or something to do with the material that was provided to the client. I mean, my feeling with this actually is that at some point, HS2, DFT, or the peer review panel should have pointed out that there was several parts of the report that were problematic and not in line with current guidance. And this can happen when you are producing this kind of evidence on a tight timetable. But but when the client has been informed by their either internal or by their expert peer review panel that there are genuine concerns about this, I don't understand, for example, why the 15 billion number was allowed to go out there when, even within the report itself, the sensitivity test suggested that, accounting for that one problem alone, halved the estimates. So, I think it would, none of us were involved with the peer review of it, but I would like to see what advice was provided to HST and DF2 about the quality of the report, and whether that was fed back to KPMG and why it was not responded to.
The advice from who?
I would like to see, presumably DFT and HS2, when they commission a £250,000 report, take internal advice on the quality of that report from their own experts, and they take expert advice, as we've been told, from a peer review panel. I would, I think you'd want to see what that peer review advice was. I mean, if that peer review advice said, "Oh, this is all fine," somehow this is acceptable, then we want to question why that peer review, what happened to make that peer review advice fail. If the peer review advice was, no, this is unacceptable, this methodology is non-standard, we really shouldn't be out there, then I think you want to understand whether it was KPMG that said, no, it is, we're not going to reply to this, or whether it was HS2 or DFT that just said, okay, we're going to publish it anyhow. Without that information, it's hard for those of us outside of the process to understand where the error, where the sources of the problem have crept in.
Well, we'll ask for it.
I mean, Dr. Wellings, what do you think? I mean, it's a funny exam question, a funny process. Dump the green book. What do you think? Is there some Machiavellian plot here?
Well, I don't want to make any specific allegations, but I think there is a general danger.
Do you feel there's a question about specific allegations?
Yes, but I mean, we need to be a fly on the wall, or for some sort of whistleblower to come forward, which I hope will happen. To find out what's really been going on. But I think there's a general concern with high-profile projects of this nature that it does become highly politicised, and that will start affecting some of the economic, like the economic case behind it. I mean, in theory, research should be objective and so on, but in practice it isn't, and it will be influenced by the politics of the whole thing, and particularly with these kind of high-profile projects with massive, a lot of political stakes, powerful vested interests dependent on HS2. I don't think the way that you had a big increase in the budget, and you also had a big decrease in the value of business travellers' time, and yet miraculously the BCR was barely changed. I mean, I don't think that kind of thing's credible. I mean, either they got it completely wrong in the previous business cases, or they're getting it completely wrong now. But there doesn't seem to be any accountability there, and I think they have lost credibility. And whether it's political influence, we don't really know, but there has to be a suspicion there.
Yeah, okay, that's very helpful. Can I just ask the three of us a question I asked of the earlier panel, which I appreciate you weren't there, but it is the really, first of all, the twofold question, if you like. First of all, why does it have to take so long to build it? Why is it a 20-year project when presumably you could, if you are approaching it from a much more commercial point of view, and if it really is so valuable to the economy, would it not be just easy to start it at do it in 100-mile stretches or 50-mile stretches rather than just rolling it out in one great long ribbon, if you like? That's the first question. And the second part of the question is, why does it have to be financed by the government? Why is this a taxpayer financing? Is there not, and I appreciate obviously ultimately it's paid for by the consumer, but why, if this is such a fantastic opportunity, why is there not a case that it can be funded by sort of commercial interests who presumably at the moment are desperate to find yield with very low interest rates at the moment? Dr. Wellings, do you want to start on that?
All right. Well, I think in terms of the timescale, I mean, it is so expensive. It would put a strain on the general transport budget to try and do it more quickly. Even now, it's going to at the peak. I think it's going to cost something like it's going to take something like 40% of the government transport investments in the peak year, which is enormous. And also there will be a danger with doing it more quickly is, it would be such a huge project, it could inflate costs because it would place strains on the construction sector and the engineering sector. Because it was a bit like the Jubilee Line extension when they had to get it finished, ready for the Millennium Dome, and a lot of the firms could name their price basically because it would create so much strains on the sector. There would be a danger and would inflate costs that way. I mean, why does it have to be financed by the government? Well, in commercial terms, it's a loss-making project. I mean, it won't. Maybe the fares will cover the operating costs. I mean, they haven't with High Speed 1, that still takes an operating subsidy, and Eurostar had to be bailed out by the government as well a few years ago. So most railways are loss-making in commercial terms. They're not technically not economically viable. I mean, it might be partly because they can't capture some of the wider economic benefits, but I think if you relax planning rules, that you could probably capture more of those than a commercial operation. But nonetheless, I don't see why private investors would get involved unless it was a rigged market and the government guaranteed revenues, like the nuclear power deal, for example.
Okay. Does anybody, Dr. Graham or Professor Graham or Professor Overman, do you have anything to add?
I mean, the only thing I would say on why it takes so long is that the Eddington report, the Barker Review of Land Use Planning, the recent LSE Commission on Economic Growth point to the fact that we are very bad in this country at strategic planning for infrastructure investment, about pushing that through the planning process. So I think that will explain a substantial part of the delays. The other thing I would point out is that I think as interesting a question is why it's going to cost so much. It is the costs. in this country do seem high relative to costs elsewhere. And I think there is something to be done on why the cost of infrastructure provision are so high, per mile of the line.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
John Thurston.
Can I just start with one question which is not quite relevant to the discussion, but is very relevant to me, living in the far north of Scotland. The current HS2 proposal, the Y, stops in the middle of England, and well south of, obviously, Scotland. To what extent have the costs or benefits taken account of the possibility of building on that to go to Edinburgh, Glasgow, or wherever? Has any account been taken of that potential, or is all the work that's being done on the assumption that it stops where it stops?
Shall I make an attempt? I'll make an attempt to answer this. Well, obviously, they include in the business case, they include the time savings for travellers from Scotland who are going to have a slightly faster journey as they link into the Y network, etc. But I think, this is a massive danger, and with high-speed rail, in that, to some extent, some of these vested interests, once, say, Leeds and Manchester get the high-speed line, then Glasgow and Edinburgh want one, and Cardiff will want one, even though, because it's all been funded by the taxpayer, but this is a political process, it's not a commercial process, so probably there'll be a spur to Liverpool instead of in lieu of massive regeneration subsidies and so on. So that's the problem. It's going to completely distort the whole economic geography of the UK, and it's going to potentially produce massive burdens.
Can I just test that? Because, for example, high-speed rail is highly competitive in time with air if it's sub 500 kilometres. And usually the total journey time, if it's sub 500 kilometres, is quickest to go by high-speed rail. If you look at carbon emissions from aircraft, they are measured around takeoff and landing, and therefore the shorter the flight, the more per passenger kilometre you have of emissions. If therefore you had a high-speed rail link that took Glasgow and Edinburgh in, you could see a tremendous amount of aviation between London, Glasgow and Edinburgh stopping, as happened between Paris and Brussels. You could see a carbon benefit, and you could also free up a lot of runway capacity in London for international flights. So, actually, yes, that's entirely political, I quite agree with you, but it's also quite important.
But I'm sceptical about the carbon benefits to start with, because high-speed rail uses huge amounts of energy. As the speed increases, you use more and more energy. Now that
nuclear-powered electricity.
Well, exactly, but in itself, it doesn't create. In itself, the high-speed rail doesn't create green electricity. So it means if they to make the statistics look good, they'll do a deal and buy the green power. But all that does is displace the fossil fuel power to another electricity user. So you're not
nuclear.
Well, but the marginal unit's likely to be gas or coal powered, because you're introducing more energy consumption by using high-speed rail, but in itself that's not creating any extra green energy capacity.
I think the answer to my question is no, nobody's really thought that through.
Well, they have, though, because the Conservatives originally introduced the idea of a high-speed line as an alternative to Heathrow expansion. It was bogus because it was never going to make much difference at all. But
either of the other two want to comment on that at all? No thanks. No thanks. Very good. Can I then go to the question of alternatives and just ask in relation to particularly, can I ask you all, first of all, do you think actually a rail network is needed or important, or should we take the pure economic case that's been made and just let it decline peacefully and replace it with roads?
I personally think that the case for rail remains reasonably strong.
Right. Is that a shared view?
I think I'd rather see a level playing field in transport. So I'd like to remove a lot of the distortions we have at the moment, which would involve phasing out rail subsidies, possibly using some of that money.
Would you want to phase out the road subsidies as well?
Well, road's completely different because you've got this £40 billion a year coming in taxation from fuel duty.
Yeah, but it doesn't cover the costs.
It does cover the costs. It hugely, it more than covers the costs. And a lot of the external costs are inflicted by the planning system rather than road use per se. So if if people.
So you'd like railway to sort of just dissolve and roads to...
It wouldn't dissolve. The Serpal report published in the 1980s did a projection on what would happen if you removed the subsidies. You find that the 20% of the network that carries 80% of the passengers would survive. You'd lose a lot of the rural areas, but you wouldn't lose the London commuter services, and you'd probably keep the main intercity Trent route. So you'd have, for most passengers...
London would be fine. Caithness, Sutherland, Easteros might as well join Norway.
No, it's irrelevant in those sort of areas anyway, largely. Most people use cars. It's 90% cars, isn't it?
Well, we'll move rapidly on. Professor Graham, right, okay. Let's have another go. Capacity on the railways is space, time and speed. Either of those can affect capacity in that you have capacity at night, which can be used, whereas passengers go day freight at night. You have the actual available rail space, and you have the speed at which you travel, because the faster you travel, the more space you require, and therefore the fewer trains can run. Are we all agreed on that? Or does anybody disagree with that?
So you're talking about this as, can I just ask you to clarify the question? I mean, are we talking about the alternatives to HS2 for dealing with the...
What I'm trying to find out is if any of you understand capacity on the railway and the function of speed and capacity. That's the question.
I'm not an expert on capacity in the railways. I mean, I really came here to talk about the statistics underpinning the...
As a general rule, increasing speed beyond a certain point, there's an optimum speed in terms of capacity because of the braking distances and so on, but that can be changed by signalling and new technology can bring things together.
You're wrong. Actually, if you go and look at the reports from just about anybody who knows about transport, they will tell you if you pick the current fast trains off, you get more capacity. So if you don't produce, because we're near to full capacity on several of our lines, if we don't take the fast trains off, we will run out of capacity. So I'm asking you, which of the options, if you like, what are the alternatives? Let's assume we don't have HS2 for all the very good business case reasons, Dr. Wellings, you put. That means that we run out of capacity within the next few years on most of our railways. The way we deal with that is by slowing them all down to ensure we can put more trains on, or by rationing the capacity, or by charging more. What do you think?
Well, it's not actually true that. I mean, it's only quite small areas of the rail network that are facing overcrowding problems if you look at it geographically. It's mostly commuter routes into London. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, the routes into Euston are among the least overcrowded, and you've got huge amounts more people standing on the tube than onto routes into Euston, by the order of magnitude higher. My solution would be, as I mentioned earlier, to firstly get a level playing field, remove the distortions by phasing out rail subsidies, removing price controls. Price controls are a huge problem because for example, the Saver fare creates this crazy situation on Friday night where the first Saver fare train is, crammed like sardines and completely overpacked. So more flexible pricing can make a massive difference. You have 12-car trains that leaving Milton Keynes at 8 o'clock, but then at 9 o'clock they're down to 4 cars. So if you can flatten the peak, there's a massive amount of extra capacity available. So you phase out the subsidies, get rid of the distortions.
Well, so now let's talk a little bit about the analysis that's been done of the alternatives to HS2, because I think that's the correct way to get into the problem. Sorry, I was a little bit confused by your line of questioning. So let me make a broad point first. Shifting the goalposts to suddenly have this about congestion and capacity is not helpful, because it suddenly gets us into a world where all we care about is whether people are standing. In the benefit, the benefit cost ratio and the wider economic benefits are trying to say, well, what's the value of the journeys that people are making? We have people standing all over the transport network on rail. So just suddenly shifting it to the amount of people standing in peak hour coming out of Euston, which actually is not that congested a station relative to others. I don't find that shift to sort of say, oh, this is all about capacity useful. What we want to do is look at the value of those journeys, do a proper analysis that sort of figures out what the the value is and compares the alternatives. Now let's look at how far we've got on that.
Can I just promote? I'm actually not talking about capacity as in terms of people standing. I'm talking about capacity in terms of actual cars on the railway line.
Well, it's the value of the journals that are facilitated. It's the value of the journeys that are facilitated. I'm perfectly happy to try and add freight into the analysis of the benefits that come from this, but just suddenly saying, oh, we've got a crowded railway, therefore we have to do something about it. Eddington was very clear on this. We will have capacity constraints right the way across the transport network by 2036. What we do in those kind of circumstances is to assess the alternatives. Now, if you go and look at the alternatives that have been assessed so far, I would make two comments on that. One is that the benefit-cost ratios are higher for the alternative to the Y. Right? So they give us benefit-cost ratios of around about 3, including wider economic benefits, not 2.3. Now, the reason why at the moment we have the government not wanting to do that is we're told something about capacity, which gets us rather back to this sort of nebulous thing of, well, we're somehow trying to address the number of trains that are on the thing rather than the benefits of the journeys that are being facilitated. The other part of it is to point to how much disruption is going to occur. Now, if you dig behind those figures, this is a 170-page report put out 2 days before Parliament, or day before Parliament was set to vote on this, you find that this estimate of 14 years of disruption is basically got at by taking the total amount spent, looking at other projects which are spending money, and seeing how much those other projects have caused disruption. So it's basically based on a disruption per pound spent measure, applied to the cost of doing the alternatives. I was struck by the fact that it's, the alternatives are at an early stage of development. I find that, so I don't think we know what the disruption would be from the alternatives, and that rather assumes that nothing is going to happen on those lines between now and 2037, which I also find hard to believe, and that we couldn't put these things in parallel. So I think, if you're asking me what the alternatives are, pointing to capacity is a little bit of a red herring, but I would also say that the assessment of alternatives to date is not particularly satisfactory, which is rather disappointing for those of us who've been pushing for the alternatives to be carefully considered for about 5 years.
It's a very interesting piece of evidence, and I know that others would probably like to come in, but we have Treasury questions this morning. It's 11:30, it doesn't leave us very much time, and we have one more colleague wanting to come in. I'm going to bring him in now, Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Let's start with Professor Graham. Your expertise is in looking at these wider economic benefits, is it not?
Yes.
Is there anyone in the country who knows more about this issue than you?
A DFT, I would imagine there is, yeah.
Right. So you're outside government. You're probably the.
Well, I know
you can say yes.
Yeah,
okay. The point is, it's a huge area of your expertise.
I know about it.
Okay, good. So there are two areas of wide economic benefits that have been in question, right? One is built into the, as it were, the modelling that we've seen from HS2, and the second one comes from the KPMG analysis. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So there are two levels, and there's a question about whether these wide economic benefits can be properly added to the base case benefit cost analysis that's been done. And the assumptions been made by HS2 is that the first level can, and we've had a serious question raised as to whether the second level has any comparability to the KPMG work. Am I right about that?
Yes, that's correct.
Good, okay, that's helpful, thank you. If the wider economic benefits were excluded from the first analysis, that is the first tier of wider economic benefits, it would fail the Green Book assessment, would it not? I mean, it would be classified as medium or possibly lower.
What is the BCR level?
1.8.
It's 1.8. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so as Henry said earlier, it's medium.
Right. So
wasn't that for the whole?
It would be.
It would be why though.
But the point is, it would be well below that. It would be at the bottom end of the 25%, the bottom 25% that Henry's.
I think that's the point Henry made.
Okay, good, thanks. Professor Overman, why did you quit the HS2 panel?
Well, but actually, I felt that the change in status of HS2 from being providing independent advice to the government to being a promoter of the scheme meant that I, no longer wanted to be involved on a consultancy basis with them.
Thank you for that. you've said that the KPMG report overestimated the wider economic benefits, in your view, by 6 to 8 times. That implies a 1.5 to 2.5 billion benefit. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And but I
not
wouldn't.
15 billion, but 1.5 to 2.5.
I think that's right, but I wouldn't view those as being additional to the wider economic benefits that get the ratio to 2.3.
Right.
I would see them as an alternative estimate of the thing that is shifting us from 1.8 to 2.3.
Right. So the two problems: one is that they're overstated by a factor of 6 to 8 times, and the second is they're not additive. They're not additive. They're as an alternative way of calculating.
I certainly wouldn't add them on top of the
Right.
BCR, including wider economic benefits. I would rather see them as an alternative estimate of the wider economic benefits that should be added to the standard BCR.
I understand. Thank you. Would you share that view, Professor Graham?
Yes.
You would share it? Okay. That's interesting. Can I just ask about the absence of alternatives? Of course, we heard from KPMG that they, in a way, would have liked to be asked the question about wider options, alternative options, and option generation. Of course, there are two levels to that, right, Professor Graham? One is increasing capacity by other means, and the second is other approaches outside using the rail network. Do you share that view?
Seems reasonable to me.
And you too, Professor Overman? But do you think it's actually surprising that there aren't more options that have been developed when you consider the amount of work that's been done, for example, in the Eddington report on looking at alternatives to rail and alternatives within rail to increasing capacity by other means?
I mean, my understanding, if you went back and looked at the earlier reports on option generation, was that they had, they do say that they considered road and other non-rail and decided that rail had to provide the solution to the problems that they were faced with. My concerns on that would be several. I've already alluded to the fact that I'm surprised at the fact that this is such an early stage of development, particularly with respect to the disruption that would be caused. I think that more regard should have been given to pricing. It seems very odd to me to rule out pricing as a mechanism for dealing with the capacity when dealing with the capacity, or whatever, however you want to phrase this, delivers a low BCR project. So I would have liked to have seen more done on pricing. I also have to say that I would have liked to have seen us dealing with alternative solutions that just dealt with the congestion question and not the speed dimension of this. When they were asked to generate alternative options, they were basically asked to generate options that met two government objectives, one of which was to increase connectivity across the network, the other was to deal with congestion on the lines. Now, I would have liked to have seen a separate set of options generated that dealt with the congestion on the West Coast, East Coast and Midland main lines to allow us to assess whether or not just dealing with the congestion would be something we'd like to do rather than necessarily getting the speed benefit.
Professor Overman, in The Economist this week it says, and I quote, "The notion that HS2 would transform the Midlands and the North is nonsense. High-speed railways in other countries have mostly benefited central cities by alleviating the need for regional offices." What's your view on that?
I think that its likely impact on the north-south has certainly been overstated. I'm not sure we know. There are reasons to think it might narrow the north-south divide. There are reasons to think it might widen the north-south divide.
Final question, and I'd be interested in any responses from any of you. The KPMG said to us that this was a sufficiently small part of the overall transport budget, that it ought to be seen in the context of the whole, and that therefore, in some sense, too much attention cannot be focused on the actual basis of the analysis itself. Is that your view? Perhaps Professor Graham, you can kick off.
No, I think the analysis is important because it's informing the debate, and it's really important that we get these numbers right and that they're scientifically rigorous.
Important the numbers are right and scientifically rigorous, you said.
Important that the numbers are done as best as we can do them, to the highest standards.
Dr. Wellings?
Well, I just made the basic point that it isn't a small part of the transport budget, it's a huge part, and in some years it will exceed the investment in the strategic road network that carries around 3 or 4 times more traffic than the entire rail network. in the UK. So yeah, it's going to be a huge chunk, massive opportunity cost. So clearly, if this investment was spent on many on schemes with much higher benefit cost ratios, it would deliver an order of magnitude higher benefits for the country.
Yeah, I think if you are going to spend £50 billion on a project, the fact that you're going to spend £1 trillion on other projects doesn't preclude the fact that you should be careful about the £50 billion.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for coming in this morning. I'm sorry this has been somewhat curtailed, but that's because we've got Treasury questions immediately afterwards. I think the committee's interest in this is undimmed, and by the two hearings we've had this morning, and the likelihood is we'll be asking for more, and we're very grateful to you in advance for the cooperation I know you'll provide. Thank you very much. Order.
Portcullis House, the Thatcher Room.